Thank you, Professor Häring, for the kind introduction. And I want first of all thank the organizers for inviting me to Thessaloniki to present our data here. I enjoy my stay here very much. Let me first briefly introduce myself a little bit. We are doing metabolomics and lipidomics for many, many years, and this is the research focus, and the daily routine work is in the central laboratory of the university clinic. We are analyzing reporting more than 6.5 million tests, test results per year, performing this in a 24/7 duty, and this means per day we see around 4,300 samples. So my topic will not be the brain, but the blood, and I think blood is an important sample material in many, if not all, diabetic research studies, as well as for the routine diagnostics of diabetes. And this brings me to a first question. Are highly accurate measurements the most significant steps in omics-driven and other diabetes research studies? What do you think? I think everybody in the room will say yes, they are very important, but I would add there is also a no, and why there is also a no I will explain during my talk in more details. The no originates from this example. These are two aliquots of plasma collected in a diabetes study. They look very similar. You cannot see any differences between these two samples. But do you know if they come from such a set of samples or from such a set of samples? That's a key question. And these samples will then finally end up in a biobank or a freezer, stored there for months or years. And then if you have a good idea what you can analyze, you will put these samples out again, perform, for example, omics analysis, but maybe also other interesting investigations of these samples. So the big point here is if you have samples of poor quality within your sample set of other samples which have high quality, there is no chance you can use instruments costing millions of euro, but if you have a poor quality, you will only achieve poor results. And this means garbage in, garbage out research. So in my talk, I will show you some pitfalls and how you can avoid this. One conclusion is that the sample quality is also very important beyond the exact measurement of the samples. And this brings me to the outline of my talk. I will show you some considerations related to sample quality and study outcome in diabetes research. The first one will deal with something before sample collection. The next one are crucial aspects of the sample collection process. The next is it possible to control the quality of samples before they end in the freezer or in the analytical instrument? And then the last few on sample storage and biobanking. So before you start, one big question is, should I collect plasma or serum or both? And is there any difference between plasma and serum? And one aspect is, you can see it here, serum and plasma is a common material and they are used equally in diabetes research. If you search the PubMed with the keywords diabetes serum or diabetes plasma. But as you all know, there is a difference in the generation of serum and plasma. Serum must be kept for 30 to 60 minutes in an upright position at room temperature. Then you can centrifuge the sample and cool it. For plasma, you have anticoagulants inside the sample tube. This means you can immediately centrifuge the sample or cool them down. And this difference has consequences because you have clotting processes and you need to expose the sample to room temperature if you want to generate serum. And these consequences are shown here. You see here a heat map of plasma and a heat map of serum. And this was a lipidome metabolome analysis. And from the 216 lipids which we analyzed, 99 showed significant differences between plasma and serum. And the reason is that during the coagulation, platelets are activated, leukocytes, erythrocytes release various compounds into serum, including enzymes and other proteins, metabolites, and lipids. And the coagulation process itself leads ex vivo in the sample tube to degradation of proteins as well as to generation and modification of lipids, species, and metabolites. So, for several reasons, we and many others do not recommend serum for omics analysis. We prefer and recommend plasma. But plasma, and this is another important aspect, standard plasma is not cell-free. In 1 milliliter of plasma, you will still find 27 million platelets if you apply really strong centrifugation of 4000 G for 10 minutes at 15 degrees. So we asked ourselves, is standard plasma maybe not useful for metabolomics analysis, and performed a comparison between standard plasma and platelet-free plasma. We applied 3 different conditions to generate platelet-free plasma, meaning time-consuming and additional centrifugation steps. And you can see from standard plasma to the platelet-free plasma, the number of platelets is reduced. And now the important question is there a difference in the metabolome? And fortunately, we find no clustering of the conditions platelet-free versus standard plasma. What we find in a principal component analysis, we find a clustering of the individuals, all 4 samples of each individual cluster. This means the metabolome is not different between standard plasma and the platelet-free plasma. So we can use standard plasma for metabolomics, lipidomics analysis. Another point in this context is the centrifugation force, and this is a study performed by Alexander Leichtle and his group. You can see here different routine centrifugation conditions and also the resulting platelets per milliliter, 137 million or 59 million. And you see, if you apply other conditions like we did, then you can reduce it, but there are still a lot of platelets, and Alexander Leichtle and his group found that this affects the metabolome. So you must carefully also respect the centrifugation conditions and harmonize this, for example, in multi-center studies. So we recommend standard plasma as sample material of choice, EDTA plasma for lipidomics and metabolomics, and the centrifugation forces are very important. If they are too low or too short, then they may affect your results, but if they are too strong, above 4,500 G, then they may cause hemolysis, which is also not a good way to generate samples. I come to the second consideration, crucial aspects of the sample collection process. As everybody knows, it's a multi-step procedure until the analysis part takes place in the hospital, other parts in the research laboratory. So it's a complex interaction of many people and also sample handling processes. In the clinic, the major goal is to care about the patient, so the interest in the pre-analytical phase is not so big, and also in complex diabetes studies, blood collection is also often entitled as the easy part. But experience from us in the laboratory are that often after the end of the study, researchers take the phone, call us, and then they are asking, the centrifuge of our ward was highly frequented. Consequently, the processing of some of the blood samples was delayed. Is this a problem for omics analysis? Or another question in this context, 1/3 of the blood of our study was drawn by inexperienced medical students. Unfortunately, this resulted in several more or less hemolytic samples. Can we still use the sample set for omics analysis? Or also freeze and thaw cycles, that some samples were thawed several times, if they still can be used. And a very common question is also that the centrifuge was in another building. We could not process the blood samples before 2 hours. Is this a problem? And in the next slides, I will answer to several of these problems. So we think the most important step with respect to affecting the sample quality is the time from blood drawing until you separate serum and plasma. So this means the exposure of whole blood to room temperature. You can answer, this is no problem. I have an SOP, it's very sophisticated, so we can exclude prolonged exposure of blood to room temperature in our study. But what happened when the study nurse draw the blood? Then she get the first phone call, then she get the next phone call, and then she ran away because of urgent duties, and she came back after 3 hours, see the samples lying still on the table, and then she sent it to the laboratory for processing. So accidentally, also if you have a sophisticated SOP, shit can happen. And we simulated this situation of sample handling and transportation by processing blood samples at once and by expose them 2, 4, 8, and 24 hours to room temperature, and then we performed non-targeted metabolomics. This study was done by Andreas Peter and Pierre Yin. Andreas Peter is also here in the room, and as you can see here, this is the control, processed at 1, 2 hour, 4 hour, 8 hour, 24 hour. The metabolome changed very pronounced. Even after 2 hours at room temperature, you find many changes in the metabolite levels. So the consequence is that SOP should be applied to really fix the processing steps and time, but this SOP should be feasible. A too strict SOP is highly error prone. For example, if you stipulate the people to centrifuge the blood within 15 minutes, maybe this will work for a few samples, but this will also fail for other samples because 15 minutes is too short to manage it always in the same way. Next point, hemolysis. You see here some moderate and strong hemolytic samples. This is the control one, but slight hemolysis is not visible by eye. But hemolysis is really an often occurring spacement hemolytic samples, around 3%, was estimated by Lippi and his group. From the daily routine is more or less hemolytic. This means in Tübingen around 100 to 130 samples per day. And you can see here that hemolysis affects, this is the non-hemolytic sample, moderate hemolytic sample, strong hemolytic sample, that metabolites are very much affected, also lipids, by hemolysis. Around 18% of all metabolite ion masses in this approach changed based on hemolysis. So Hemolytic samples should be excluded, at least from high-resolution OMICS analysis. And if you find biomarkers, lipids or metabolites affected by hemolysis, like tryptophan or lysophosphatidylcholine 16O and so on, they must be thoroughly validated for robustness before nominating them as a biomarker that you are not that they are not caused by hemolysis effects. And I would recommend that all plasma or serum samples should be tested for hemolysis before use or storage, at least for high-resolution analytical projects. Next, the question, is it possible to control the sample quality? Hemolysis we can easily measure, but can we measure the sample quality? Here we have some possibilities in the routine lab to perform a so-called Hill check to check hemolysis, icteric samples and lipemic samples. You can apply SOPs for high sample quality, or at least protocols for sample handling. But up to now, to evaluate really the quality is not possible. So we aimed to find a biomarker detecting the prolonged exposure of whole blood to room temperature. And this study design was is shown here. Freshly prepared samples, then whole blood exposed for 2 and 4 hours on ice or at 4 degrees, and whole blood exposed for 2 and 4 hours to room temperature. We choose these 2 and 4 hours because after 2 hours in a clinical setting, most of the study samples should reach the centrifuge, and then plasma or serum could be separated. And after 4 hours, almost all samples should be processed. After that sample collection, we perform non-targeted metabolomics, covering more than 1,800 metabolite ion features. We identified then, after this screening, biomarker, verified as by mass spectrometric fragmentation patterns, verified them by a standard, and then performed targeted analysis of this quality marker, testing robustness, validate them in plasma and serum samples. We used there more than 2,000. From results from the non-targeted analysis, as I said, more than 1,800 metabolite ion features, and you see at room temperature, as shown before in the heat map, after 2 hours, almost 10% of all these 1,800 metabolites has changed significantly after 4 hours. These are around 16%. We also see a slight change on ice when you cool the sample immediately, but this is less than 2% even after 4 hours. The biomarker we identified is sphingosine 1-phosphate, entitled D18-2, and you can see here in 79 samples per time point that freshly prepared samples at whole blood for 2 hours at 4 degrees or for 4 hours, there is no change. But if you expose whole blood to room temperature, then you will find a significant increase. Subsequently, we validated this marker in a set of biobank samples, more than 1,400 from 11 biobanks all around the world, including the WHO biobanks and also from the German research centers. And first, we defined a cutoff level for good sample quality, and this means were the levels of S1PD18-2 of samples exposed for 4 hours at 4 degrees. And as you can see, in some biobank samples, we found many samples above this cutoff level, but this means not that you should throw away these samples. This is an important note. These plasma or serum samples still can be used, not for high-resolution omics analysis, but you can use them to analyze robust parameters like liver enzymes, albumin, cortisol, haptoglobin, and so on. When we look then on data from the biobanks, and here shown an example from biobank number 4, these are serum samples. The samples were collected by different persons in a clinical setting under daily clinical routine conditions, and you can see that good samples were achieved, but also not so good samples. All these samples were collected according to SOPs. From the same hospital, samples which were collected by a specialized team which can focus really on sample collection at one site, at the study ward, and then it's possible really to generate samples of high quality. That means it's necessary really that the people can focus on the sample collection, and under daily routine condition it's hard to achieve samples for good omics, good quality for omics analysis. So the take-home message here is that delayed handling and processing of blood samples before centrifugation can be assessed, and this can be done without knowledge of the pre-analytical process when you quantify the S1P-D18-2. Consideration 4, sample storage, and here the most relevant point, repetitive freeze and thaw cycles. And this cannot be prevented because the number of aliquots is always limited. And in particular, your most valuable, most interesting samples are taken very often in and out because you want always to analyze the most relevant, important samples. And therefore, we study the robustness of plasma samples, EDTA plasma, generated a control sample, processed immediately, then compared this with 1-time frozen, 2-time frozen and thawed, and 4-time frozen and thawed. And the comparison between the standard plasma biobank sample means 1-time frozen, thawed, and then analyzed with the freshly prepared samples showed no significant difference. And for me, very unexpected was the next finding that only less than 1% of all metabolite ion masses changed after 2 and 4 freeze and thaw cycles. So in general, the plasma is very resistant to repetitive freeze and thaw cycles. Unfortunately, this was statistic. What we also did, we looked at the individual metabolome pattern, and there we detected, you see the samples of most individuals clustered together, so there is no change, but we have also 2 out of 10 of these plasma samples from individuals which are sensitive to freeze and thaw. So there is an individual difference between persons with respect to the stability of their plasma or resistance to freeze and thaw cycles, at least for omics analysis. The suggestion for handling of stored biobank samples, non-refrozen plasma aliquots are recommended if possible. If this is not possible, then you should avoid to mix up samples exposed to different freeze and thaw cycles at least. I come to the final brief summary, repeating some of the things I already said. Blood collection is really the easy part of complex diabetes studies, but I hope I could convince you, may heavily affect the quality of samples and consequently also the outcomes and success of omics results, but possibly also beyond in your diabetes research study. And poor sample quality caused by delayed handling can be identified by measuring S1P-D18-2. SOPs, as I already said, are valuable tools to regulate the pre-analytical process, but the recommendation may vary from SOP to SOP. So if you are planning a multi-center study, please look at all SOPs in the different centers, even after 2-3 months when you started, because sometimes logistical limitations lead then to modifications of the SOP, and then you will have bias in the different sample sets. possibly. Once again, they must be feasible. It makes no sense to write an SOP which cannot be fulfilled by the people who should do this job. So I'm at the end of the talk. Want to thank all the cooperation partners in Tübingen, Copenhagen, and in Dalian in China. And I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Herr Lehmann. Very important messages. I was wondering, for instance, if you have yourself a biobank very much controlled, as hopefully we have, but you want to have a validation cohort, and you ask to have samples from another biobank. So, and you presented data that the quality is very variable or even poor. What is the suggested procedure to check whether we can use these samples for validation of our samples? What would you suggest?
If these are, for example, 500 samples, I would begin to measure this biomarker S1P-D18-2 in every 50 sample, and when then the quality is okay, maybe we can run such a round again. And if the quality is not so good, then more samples should be analyzed and check if this set is really useful or not so useful. But the problem always is, if you find out that the sample quality is not so good, then it is a kind of high diplomacy to really bring this message to the provider of this sample set. But yeah, so stepwise, first look in some samples and then go into detail.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have time for questions. So all questions will be asked later.